in the second Sherlock Holmes film, the use of another strong woman was the gypsy in the movie.
Oh, in Game of Shadows. In Game of Shadows, I think.
Game of Shadows.
Yeah. In Game of Shadows, yes. Is that Numi?
Yeah, Numi
Rapace. Yeah, she is strong. She also is reduced to sort of weeping over the death of her brother at the end of the film, but I think she accomplishes a lot of other very interesting things previous to that. When I first saw it, I had sort of a problem with the Holmes of the canon having a peculiar gentility and civility with women, and then him pushing Mary Morrison off a train, which was a wide gap for me. And I know that he did it for the noblest of reasons. But the image is sort of striking. So yeah, Numi Rapace is a very interesting role in that film, and I think that she probably deserves further exploration, because she's certainly a much larger role than Irene Adler. Which is interesting. I don't feel like the Irene Adler role in Game of Shadows particularly, it could have been anyone. It didn't need to be Irene.
Just a question about Game of Shadows. As a fanboy, I would like to think that, yes, Irene Adler isn't really dead, and Les is mighty coy about that. But on the other hand, it really doesn't bother me if she is, because as she is referred to in the original story as the late Irene Adler, if she is going to die, doesn't it seem better to go out like this with Professor Moriarty of all reasons being responsible, instead of just perhaps dying of consumption a couple of years after the events of Scandal in Bohemia?
Well, I do see your point, and that's an interesting point, but no, I don't think so. She basically, as I said earlier, exists in that film in order to give Holmes feelings. And dying in your bed peacefully would probably, I want to die in a fire saving a baby, personally. I want to do something awesome when I'm dying. But I don't think particularly that being murdered in kind of a ridiculous way by Professor Moriarty for being a bad postal service is a glorious ending.
No, I don't think she had a very glorious death there. I'd like to see her return and do something a little bit better.
And I understand why you have no problem with it. It just is sort of, okay, so she was UPS and now she's dead.
Do you want to just ask a question?
Claire, go for it.
Sure.
Go for it.
Sorry.
These may be more comments than questions. I guess I wanted to point out, I guess, in Game of Shadows, how far we've come from a study in terror when we can actually have a transgender Sherlock Holmes, in which the first time we've seen, we know that Holmes has dressed as an old woman.
Oh, transvestite.
Oh, he means transvestite.
And dances.
He doesn't mean
and he dances with
transvestite's different.
Yes.
Right. And he dances with Watson. But I wanted to point out about a study in terror that I think it's a little unfair to criticize the film as Maltby did when it really had a more limited objective. I've always thought it was one of the best Sherlock Holmes films, and interestingly, the Ellery Queen novelization doesn't have any of the kind of visual problems that the film does. But my point was going to be the marketing of the film. I mean, this was a comic book. When you look at the posters for the film, and it says the first Caped Crusader, and it shows Biff, Bam, and that kind of thing, and all the posters, it was always a comic book. Holmes isn't a very serious character. Remember, he's hired by the Merchants Association.
Don't get me wrong. I love A Study in Terror, but that's exactly my point. My point is not. We were discussing this when we were out that Lyndsay is comparing an adaptation to the canon and is making a comment about that. I'm comparing adaptations to adaptations not because what they say about Holmes, or necessarily what they say about the adaptations, but because what the adaptations say about us. And the fact that that film is marketed that way to that audience in 1965 is revealing, because it's a similar kind of notion, and it's not the audience is not there for that same film in 1979, which says something about what we did with ourselves in our learning and our consciousness raising in those years.
So both of our approaches were completely different. I was comparing directly to canon. She's doing adaptation, so different comments were made.
I'd love to know what you have to say about Mary Morstan in the two Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes movies, because seems very smart and very capable. She doesn't kick any kind of ass, and she's not a detective, and she's the only one kind of in those movies without superpowers. But she still kind of, to me at least, holds her own.
I love her.
She's super powerly solid.
She's fierce. I bloody love her. She wins at everything, including being thrown off a train and being okay about it, and encountering naked Stephen Fry, which must have been a little bit disconcerting, maybe. At first. No, she's great. I think that the Mary Morstan in the new Warner Brothers films, the Mary Morstan to me is way more satisfying from a feminist standpoint. If I were to just like stand in feminist shoes, I prefer the Mary Morstan to the Irene Adler by leaps and bounds. I think she's 100 times more awesome. And I love that somebody took Mary Morstan and made her a badass. I think that's great. I do think at the end of Game of Shadows, the like, oh, and meanwhile, Mary's been decoding this the whole time is kind of a gimme after she's been thrown off a train. But it's great that she's been given this sort of street cred, and that's a woman in the canon who has been overlooked many, 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 many times by many adaptations, including mine. And I think she's awesome in both films.
Question here to your right. Thank you for Ashley. In looking at the photos that you showed of The Study in Terror, which I haven't seen in a number of years, so I was seeing it for the first time in a while, they look like they all could have come from a Hammer film. And the point of a Hammer film in the 60s, as far as women go, they either bit somebody and then got killed, or they got killed without biting somebody, or they got bit and got killed, but they were there to get killed. Do you think maybe the film was a deliberate attempt by the producer to make an imitation Hammer movie with a Holmes veneer, and they just went with what was stylistic then?
It certainly was going toward the same market. Of course, there was a Hammer horror film not that much earlier than that. So, yeah, 6 years, right? 1959, yeah. Hammerhound. Yeah, I mean, it may have been going toward the same market, and it may have been attempting to accomplish the same things, and the women were basically incidental to that. They were there to be pretty and to be well made up, and to have not as many clothes as would be period satisfying from a historical perspective, but then they die and don't messily sort of fiddle with the plot in any way or attempt to really mess with the characters and how they deal with what they're doing. But that's the point, because there was a market for that then, and there isn't a market for that now. Now we would recognize that as something that would be we wouldn't appreciate. Our sensibilities wouldn't take that. You know, Hammer is fun to go back and watch because we instinctively like to go and have that kind of retro feeling, and they're fun to study. But if they were just released to a mass market audience now, people would probably be fairly repelled. If they were the same kinds of films that they were making, you know, the Frankenstein films and the Dracula films and that sort of thing, I don't think that those would go down very well now, which just proves my point, really, is that we've grown, which is good.
And it's great that it's nostalgia.
Yeah.
I have a question I'd like to, I'm struck by the, Lyndsay, you wrote Dust and Shadows, which has a Ripper element, and it's not been made into a movie yet. So if it was, I guess, a third wave feminism, or Ashley, if you've had a chance to read Dust and Shadows and think about it from a perspective of how the women are handled within that. Let's hear you talk about each other.
Oh, well, I can't wait for it to be made into an adaptation, and then I'll include that in the next presentation.
Well, the adaptation, I don't know. I certainly can't speak to that. That's like sort of an author's pipe dream that, you know, like it's very unlikely and always almost impossible to get a book to film sort of thing. But I was specifically interested when writing Dust and Shadow in portraying, it doesn't have Freemasons, it doesn't have royal family, it doesn't have underground cults that are literally under the ground, although I liked that book. But it is about how it's scary to pursue a serial killer who is a sexual predator pre-Freud. And I thought that part was scary enough. And I think that Holmes in his dealings with women in the canon he's generally much more genteel. a million times more genteel than Cumberbatch, about a cajillion times more genteel than Downey even, and way more genteel than now Johnny Lee Miller. And so I tried to bring a lot of that sympathy that he has just for women that is very canonical. And you can't always trust Holmes on the subject of Holmes. You can hardly ever trust Holmes on the subject of Holmes. Holmes will say things like, women, never to be, well, they aren't ever to be trusted, neither are men. but Holmes will just say ridiculous things. Oh, they're women, blah, blah, blah.
How can you build on such a quicksand?
How can you build on such a quicksand? Exactly. Thank you for the no look past there. And Watson is way more accurate on Holmes than Holmes is on Holmes. So I tend to write Sherlock Holmes as Watson writes Sherlock Holmes, as opposed to how Holmes talks about himself, because a lot of people believe Holmes when he says ridiculous things, and he's just spouting out total crap. He doesn't behave like that. He loves women. I mean, like he doesn't love any particular one, I don't think. But look at how urgent he is about finding Violet Smith. Like, look at that. Look at the solitary cyclist and how urgently he feels deeply about finding Violet Smith and making sure that she's okay. So many instances of this. Abbey Grange, where he's like, Captain Crocker, highest of fives, I love you. So it's a pretty feminist in that sense, and I think that was what I was trying to bring out in Dust and Shadow, so I hope if it ever is an adaptation, they would bring that out.
We have time for one more.
This question here to your right.
Which one? Okay. So, just out of curiosity. So just out of curiosity, if you were the directors for either the Guy Ritchie movies or any of that, what would you do differently?
You're going to have to come
Ashley
out with
gets
this
to do this first.
You're going to have to come out with this after dinner, and we'll talk about it for hours, I'm sure. But really, I like strong female characters who stand up on their own 2 feet. But maybe I'm in a minority as far as feminists are concerned, and I do consider myself a feminist. But I'm completely okay with a woman making use of absolutely everything in her arsenal to take care of herself. So if that has to do with being sexy and taking your clothes off, I have no problem with that. I don't think a woman being naked to control a man is anti-feminist necessarily, especially like as Irene Adler does in BBC Sherlock. She does it because of an intellectual reason, and I have no problem with that. So as long as we've got female characters who are using their brains as well as whatever else they have, I'm happy.
I think ditto everything Ashley just said, and I would also probably make the argument just from my personal perspective that I wouldn't directorially change a lot of things in those films because they're very stylistic. If I were the screenwriter, I might tweak it. Like if I were... So, for instance, I really hope Irene Adler is alive in the 3rd film. The Warner Brothers. It's fridging, it's not cool. But yeah, I think that, and I do think that it is fair to try to explore other canonical female characters who rocked. Like I would, if I were screenwriting for stuff like that, I would love to talk about people like Kitty Winter, man, or like, and I love Mary.
I like Mary Brackenstall.
Mary Brackenstall. I mean, there's so many great women in the canon, and we get kind of hung up on like Irene Adler, and we get hung up on things like Jack the Ripper because they're iconic. And I thought it was really interesting yesterday that poor Robert Doherty thought that maybe a bunch of people watching CBS Sherlock wouldn't know who Irene Adler was if her name was said. And it's like, well, only the tens of millions of people who watch Warner Brothers and BBC. Yeah. So when you add those tens of millions of people together, then that would be a significant figure. Who would know?
Apart from those.
But apart from those people, and us, no one would know who she was. But we do get kind of stuck, don't we?
Yeah. Well, it's partially because the medium of film, it's hard to adapt. You can't adapt a single short story to the medium of film without adding
Impossible.
a lot. Yeah. So to find some of the best female characters, you have to go to the short stories, and then you're going to have to make a sort of a compilation and a collage of all the things that you want out of particular short stories, and to pick a single female character out of those and to make her part matter to the film, you're going to have to make most of that short story in there, and then you're going to have to find something else for her to do for the other hour and 45 minutes, so it's a major challenge. which is why I think Sherlock Holmes is kind of better on television, but that's just me.
Well, doing Sherlock Holmes in long format is almost impossible. I mean, Conan Doyle couldn't manage to write a novel about Sherlock Holmes without cutting him out for half of it. So I can vouch for the fact that it is almost impossible to do, to keep Sherlock Holmes down for that long. You have to do terrible things to him. And Conan Doyle is not, Conan Doyle is my absolute hero in every sort of writing sense, but the short stories are too short to adapt, and the novels are formatted badly to adapt to film. So, you know, if I were screenwriting, I could say that, yeah, I'd love to see some of the other female canonical characters who are awesome.
Or
If I were,
anyone.
and if we were directing, I think, you know, directing's about style and about, I like both.
I like it all, but I would probably write new characters as well, because I think.
Great. Great.